Welcome
back
to the podcast. Welcome to the Visceral Voice Podcast. Welcome to the Visceral Voice Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Schneider. Through this podcast, I aim to bring you the most current, up-to-date research on voice science, function, pain science, movement, and everything in between. I am on a quest to learn everything I can about the living, breathing body and its intricate connection to the voice. This podcast documents the continuation of my learning and my experience as a professional singer, a nutritional consultant, a movement specialist, and a manual therapist. Join us as we strive to provide current, knowledgeable, creative, and compassionate information to help you restore, regain, and create happiness and success on your vocal journey. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I am so thrilled today to be joined by Jillian Paige.
That's a lot.
Jillian is the founder of Meisner in Music, the premier class to infuse the Meisner technique with singing. Jillian received her master's in musical theater from Oklahoma City University, where I also went. Her bachelor's in classical vocal performance from Belmont University, and studied Meisner under Terry Martin, a direct pupil of Meisner's, and Ted Wald. Jillian is based out of New York City and has performed with companies such as Actors Theater of Louisville, the Nashville Opera, and Kentucky Opera. She is passionate about helping singers maintain beautiful singing while achieving emotional freedom and impulsivity in the moment. Hi, Jillian. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm so honored. I was getting ready this morning, just thinking what an amazing podcast this is and how it's been a dream of mine to be on it for years now. You all have been going strong for so long. So I'm just really grateful to be here.
I'm so grateful to have you. And you've been on my mind for years as well as having you a guest. So I'm glad that it finally worked out to have you on. So Jillian, if you don't mind just kind of starting with your story, whatever you want to share of your experience and your journey coming into the musical world, into classical singing, and into the work that you do now.
Yeah, I got into classical singing through doing the Governor's School of the Arts in Kentucky. And that was really what opened my eyes to the possibility of pursuing vocal performance as a career. My parents are both classically trained musicians as well. My dad is an orchestra musician and my mom is a church organist and pianist. So I was always around it, but Governor's School was really the thing that made me see it as a viable career. So I studied classically at Belmont University, which I loved, and we didn't have any acting classes. So we all were graduating with performance degrees with no acting whatsoever. It wasn't that they were proponents of standing and singing by any means, but I left that degree with a lot of knowledge about what was happening vocally and very little knowledge about how to storytell effectively at the same time. I, shortly after graduating at Belmont, did my first equity play in Nashville, Time Stands Still, with the Actors Bridge Ensemble. And in that play, there were only 3 other actors, all of whom were Meisner trained. So every rehearsal was different. Every time we did the show, it was different. And we just played so much. So I didn't know what Meisner was, but I knew I was having a magical blast. Then I went to grad school, where I studied musical theater, and we had a lot more acting, which was great, but still there was missing the link between what I was learning in voice lessons and what I was learning in acting classes. It felt like if I tried to act fully, some aspect of my vocal technique would suffer. And then if I focused only on the voice, my face went away. I wasn't able to fully be in the moment with what was happening for me emotionally and impulsively. So in grad school, I met an amazing tenor named Michael Schaefer. And in my early 20s, we moved to Chicago to both pursue careers. He was going to DePaul University, and I was acting and singing, and it was so lovely. And within our first month of moving there, he got this sore on his tongue that had been there for a while, checked out. And it was truly the week of registration at DePaul. He was going for vocal performance, his master's, and it was cancer. So we moved back to Texas so that he could be with his family for treatment. And a month after signing a lease and 11 days after getting married, he died relatively unexpectedly, even though he was a cancer patient. So I was stuck in Dallas, Texas, just sort of like unable to deal with what was happening and really far from my support system, even though his family was great. And I thought, let me throw myself into something. And there was a Meisner class, and I said, let's just do that. And it was so groundbreaking for me as a performer and for my grieving process. The whole premise of the Meisner technique is to take things moment to moment and to sink into them rather than feel like we have to get away from them. So, as someone who was almost toxically positive during Michael's cancer journey, I mean, you do what you have to do. So, I think we were, hoping for a miracle and things, which makes sense. But as someone who had just gotten out of months of that, it was really freeing to sit with what was and really be able to marinate in emotions rather than wish them away. As a performer, Meisner truly opened up my life, and I thought, oh, I have the answer to everything. Like my singing through song, my acting through song is going to be so much easier now. And then I did my first musical about 6 months after taking an intensive Meisner class, and everything went out the window. I went straight back into singer brain, and I was only focused on how good or bad I sounded. And I was like, oh no, where's my Meisner work? So I moved to New York and thought there's got to be a Meisner in music class, and there wasn't. So after a year of being here in 2017, I started workshopping it with some friends in a sweaty little studio at Ripley Greer, and we're 7 years in, almost 8 now. It's just been really eye-opening and so fantastic for me as a performer and a person to just deepen in I'm enough, and whatever I have going on or whatever I feel like doing or not doing in a moment is totally okay.
Mhm. Thank you so much for sharing that journey. I think of, I knew that was part of your journey in asking, and because I've read it on your page and we've chatted a little before. And I had a friend of mine who lost her husband we were in our 20s, and this year I just lost my brother-in-law to cancer. So your story just resonated so deeply with me, having lived through a support system, being a
Hmm.
support system for these other people in my life, and
Hmm.
how beautiful that you had Meisner work during that time,
Yeah.
and how powerful and how lucky we can be as artists, and how powerful some of these modalities can be in our own
Hmm.
healing process. It's just
Absolutely.
incredible to me. So thank you again
Yeah.
for being open to sharing that journey. So I want to transition. You had said you weren't entirely sure what Meisner work was at the time, but you were having a magical blast. So for the listeners who don't know anything about Meisner work, what is Meisner technique?
Meisner technique stems from the Stanislavski School of Acting. What happened was in the 20s, the Moscow theater group. Oh no, now I'm forgetting the name and someone's going to want to correct me. So please correct me. It's the Moscow Art Theater or the Moscow Theater Troupe. Anyway, these Russian actors came through who were trained by Stanislavski, came through the US, and for the first time, we were seeing acting that was totally based in reality. And Marlon Brando is a person who came from that school of thought. You'll see in his acting, it's so different from those that he's on stage with a lot of times in his early work because it's so based in actual truthful human behavior. So Many people came from that school of thought: Lee Strasberg, Stella Adler, and Sanford Meisner. Everyone branched off and did variations of what they took from Stanislavski's writing and work. What Meisner believed to be the best way to achieve that was that acting is the reality of doing. So we are not focused on producing, going in the past for an emotion, but we're truly just focused on the doing of being in the moment and observing what's happening now and trusting that I am enough. Again, what we're creating is truthful human behavior, and we're already human. So 98% of that is already worked out for us. But that extra 2% of polishing away is getting out of our own ways and getting back to those childlike impulses that, as polite, mature adults, we often dull for the sake of social survival.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had read a little bit about Meisner, and so we have like method acting,
Right.
and a number of artists that we met, like Daniel Day-Lewis is a method actor.
Mhm.
And what I loved about what I had read about Meisner was that it takes your emphasis away from you yourself and places it on the other people and your surroundings. Is that
100%. Yes, exactly. The onus is not on me at all. And that's part of the acting as the reality of doing. In method and some other types of acting techniques, there can be a lot placed on preparation, which for me just feels too heavy. And in this technique, exactly right. Everything I need and everything I'm sourcing from is exterior to me. So it's really utilizing exteroception to get what my impulses are about the moment. And that's tough for singers who are really analytical, um, and not used to that improvisational work.
Mhm. Yeah, but I think it can be almost safer than something like method because we've seen method acting go really far with some of the actors that use it, to a point that it can be harmful to themselves as well as the people around them.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'm sure there are a number of people that use it and it's stunning and amazing and their performances are beyond brilliant. But the amount of actors we see who try to do full method acting and really go into it, and some of these characters that are just so unbelievably crazy, it it can be kind of terrifying to see where they go and how that actually influences their own psyche. Where
Totally.
something here with Meisner, what I love about this and what it reminds me of is I had the great opportunity of seeing Antonio Banderas in Nine, the musical.
Oh,
He did it years ago with Chita Rivera. And I sat there, I don't know, in like this first or second row, the $20 seats at the time that you got last minute.
yeah.
And I remember watching, and I'm not in either. He's one of the most brilliant actors in the world, which he very much might be, or it was the fact that it was not his first language.
Mm.
But either way, or a combination of the two, I had never, it was some of the best acting on stage I had ever seen. And it was because he listened. And I felt like he was so present in his listening to the other
Mhm.
person on stage that in the presence moment of listening created these natural impulses to happen. That was some of the greatest I've ever seen in my life.
Right. Oh, I love that. I have goosebumps hearing that.
Yeah. So it sounds like, and I don't actually have any experience with Meisner, but from reading about what it is, I'm like, oh, that sounds exactly like that experience when I watched Antonio Banderas in Nine, the musical.
Absolutely. Right. That listening, that observation is part of the acting being the reality of doing. If you're only focused on yourself, there's no room to be listening or getting your impulses off of something else. And everything, it's very Wizard of Oz. Like everything we have to go home is already within us. Everything we have, everything we need to be a free person on stage is already within us. Now it's up to us to get our focuses, as Meisner says, the heat off of ourselves, placing it on others. And you being a fantastic listener and observer makes you interesting to watch. Jeff Goldblum is a famous Meisner actor. And he says that you are interesting to the extent that you are interested. So
Hmm.
it doesn't make you interesting to watch if you're coming up with things and feeling like there's so much pressure to create a moment rather than to just observe. Like Esper likens it, William Esper is a famous Meisner teacher. He likens the listening to being like a baby or a kitten who is just fascinated by the things around them. And especially with our screen obsessed ways right now, we're getting further and further away from finding fascination in the mundane.
Hmm. Yeah, that is a very powerful point. And how that relates to our everyday life, how that kind of work is so important, has always been important in how we live. But especially
Mhm.
right now, with all of us being so isolated in an actual device rather
Mhm.
than communication with those around us, and how well we can be present and listen to each other and hear each other, not just hear, like, yeah, someone's talking at me, but I'm busy doing something else, as opposed to being here with you,
Mhm.
listening to you, and being able to truly respond and truly emote and have a sense of communication and relation and chemistry.
Yeah. To be permeable to that stuff and to really be impacted by what I'm hearing from you. It's honestly, Meisner has gotten me and my students in trouble sometimes throughout the years because I'm so honest. I talk about wanting to put on our wetsuit of social armor. Like, we don't want to be this way all the time because, of course, in a city or anywhere else, you don't, when someone is an asshole, you
Mhm.
do want to let it roll off your back. However, in the art, we're not there to watch people be polite. We're there to watch the breadth of the human experience. And that includes being deeply impacted by everything that's going on to you and around you. But I had this experience recently at the airport where my Meisner came out a little bit when it probably shouldn't have. I went up to the security person, they're going, all right, next in line. And I go up and he scoffs. He's like, God, oh, get back, show your ID. And I was like, are you mad at me? And he's like, no, I'm not mad at you. And it wasn't worth it to like talk to him and just say, are you talking to me? But I just couldn't help myself. I'm like, what's with the dude? What are we doing? Um, but moments like that, I have to be like, well, I probably could have just ignored him and just showed him my ID. But it really starts to come into your real life and like I'm affected by everything and I will get really comfortable calling things out and having agency for my experience because that's what Meisner helps us to do. And gosh, I understand why, but I think that so much of singing dampens our personal experience and we have to be able to yes know technically what's going on with the voice but then also listen to how am I being impacted by this moment and how is the voice being impacted, which helps us better facilitate those instruments.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that especially with the voice, you can either get into a pattern of, am I holding on to my technique?
Right.
Or we can also get into a physical memory, whether we're conscious of it or not, of something that didn't go well on stage in front of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, and your nervous system is still holding on to that experience. And how do we let go of the fear of that happening again, both from an emotional component as well as a physical that, now it lives within our body. And how can we help that out of our body?
One thing I didn't expect with Meisner and music, I thought that I was just creating an acting class for singers to bridge that gap. And what happened was it helps so much with vocal technique and stage fright, which I think a lot of times go hand in hand. We're like, why is what I was doing in the practice room not coming across when I'm in front of people that I'm nervous in? And I think a huge part of that is going, what is happening right now and how is it impacting me? So when we feel nervous, let's say that your body, your nervous system is giving you a response of like sweaty palms and stacked breath. So in Meisner, instead of being like, let's circumvent that and throw a tool at it that makes it better, we would sink into, okay, so this is happening. And in fact, sometimes like squeeze the juice out of it, I'll say, like get even more from that and be like, let's see what happens if I lean into those sensations and avoid looking at them as threats and rather just something incidentally that's happening about this moment. And it's like an alert on your phone. The more we ignore, the more alerts stack up. And so when we pay attention to it and open the text of what our body is sending us, it helps us easily move through that moment and be present and not taken back to something that might have happened in the past, whether consciously or unconsciously.
That was such a great analogy of the alerts on the phone. Like, yes, that's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
That's just going to keep piling up. And how our nervous system responds to that, eventually it's just going to overflow.
Right.
Wow.
And it's terrifying. I want to be clear too that this work is really uncomfortable and it's uncomfortable for a reason because we're not circumventing things that are happening in the moment. It's almost like with Meisner, the more, okay, I say this wincing because I know how this sounds, but bear with me. The more discomfort you feel, the more right it is, the more toward the good stuff we're getting. And eventually you become I wouldn't say it's easier to sit with the discomfort, but you become more familiar with the feeling of like, oh yeah, this is uncomfortable because I'm acknowledging my human experience in this moment, but this will help my singing and this will help me be a more present actor who is totally able to take on whatever the moment throws at me. So it's thrilling over a period of time, but in the beginning and even now 10 years into studying it, I bump up against how painful that discomfort can be sometimes. I'm like, gosh, I wish I were better, or I wish this moment wasn't happening to me again. But if it's happening in the moment, we have to acknowledge it. And it makes us, I think, better artists and people.
I do too. I think that acknowledging that, or the recognition that as whole people, we have whole emotions. And that means grief and anger and sadness and all of it. And
Mhm.
I know those emotions can be so incredibly complicated, complex, challenging to work with. But when we're able to accept that that is part of a whole and that isn't even necessarily a massive, sometimes it's like 80% and sometimes it's like 0.2%. And
Mhm.
that's when I was in college. My religion professor, actually, I went to Oklahoma City University.
Yes.
So, Dr. Starkey, I don't know if he was still there when you were there.
I don't know because I went there for the master's, so I didn't have to take
Oh,
any
okay.
religion
You didn't take,
courses.
okay. He was wonderful. And
Oh,
he pulled, and actually I took a religion class every year I didn't have to, but I did because I liked
wow.
him so much. He was a Jesuit priest turned Quaker. He was
Oh,
so
awesome.
fascinating. He's passed away now, but
Mm.
and he pulled me into his office, that I had gone through this major surgery in high school
Yes.
and with my rib cage, and then had a very challenging freshman year vocally, uh, just trying to navigate kind of being broken down old school with already kind of feeling like broken from previous
Right.
years. And he pulled me into his office, I think it was my junior year, and he said, I am going to be so open and honest with you, and I hope you can hear me. You have to lean into and accept your anger.
Wow.
And I was like, what do you mean? I'm not angry. I don't have any anger at all. I'm a
Right.
super happy person and everyone sees
Mhm.
me as a happy person. And he said, you have anger. And I know because I was you when I was younger. And right now you're a light switch.
Mm.
And it's just a matter of when that light switch is going to be turned on. And I don't want to see it overflow in you like it did for me.
Ooh,
And I
what
was
a
like,
guy.
oh, and it was crazy because I left that. I remember going into a master class and I wanted to sing something on, so it was a little later, I think it was fourth year. And I wanted to sing something on my recital.
Mhm.
And it was one of my best friend's compositions. And my voice teacher said, only if we change the key. And I said, I don't want to change the key. I want to sing it where he wrote it. And he was in the room too. So best friends in the room, who composed the piece. And I said, I don't want to do that. I want to do it where it's composed. And we had a little back and forth between my voice teacher and I, whom I love,
Yes. You
Dr.
said he was, yes.
Larry Keller. Yes, I love Mr. Keller. Um, but we had a little back and forth, and I went out of the room, and Joel chased me, and I went into the little voice studio, and I was livid,
Oh,
absolutely livid. And Joel was like, "Don't be mad, don't be," and I was like, "I'm so angry." And I said, "But you have to let me have this moment right now."
absolutely.
Actually, I don't think it was Joel. It was actually my friend Chris that chased me. Either Chris or Joel. Someone chased me after and was like, don't be, it's okay. This is what he meant. And I'm like, this isn't about Mr. Keller at all. This is about me holding on to anger for several years that I have never expressed. And I
Mm,
need it. I need to be able to experience this in this moment right now because it's also not about the key.
right.
So luckily I was able to recognize all of that. And I
Wow.
was only able to experience that because Dr. Starkey, in his absolute amazing, authentic, true voice said something to me that was very hard to hear,
Yeah.
but absolutely what I had to hear.
Right. Yeah, it's tough as human beings and especially as singers because emotions like anger, I think we're like, well, first of all, we feel like that's going to cause harm to what is happening for me vocally in the moment. But second of all, I think that we feel like anger has a stock look. And as you said, I'm a happy person. I'm not an angry person, right? But we hold dualities, and your anger doesn't have to look like Mr. Hyde's. It can look like a happy person who's having an angry moment and needs to be chased by their friends.
Yeah.
It's so it's really tricky work, right? To teach people, and also I want to lead people to those discoveries at their own time. So as your Mr. Starkey did so beautifully and you came to so authentically, I love that like you were gently shepherded there, and then when it was time you were like, no, it's I'm ready to let the anger out. So I think that Meisner is for everyone, but I don't think that everyone is at the right time ready for Meisner. I think it really has to be like, I need to face something and I need to unearth something. And then once you do, it's absolutely addicting and vast, amazing work. But it's, you got to be careful because sometimes I'll have someone who, if they were to let the anger out, like maybe other things in their lives would unravel. And so that's really interesting to navigate. But I love it.
Yeah. So let's dive into Meisner a little bit. What are some of the foundations of Meisner? And then I want to kind of go from there because you offer a bunch of different programs. So
Yeah.
what are the foundations and what does it look like when someone first comes to you to start studying Meisner?
My associate teacher, Adam White, puts it so beautifully in that he believes, and I now believe as well, that there are two divisions of the Meisner technique: present moment awareness and emotional preparation. And I think a lot of times people want to jump to character development and how my moment before, which is all fantastic, but it's typically something you've already got a way of doing. And what's the base principle of Meisner is that I am enough and I'm just here to observe. So we start out with each student with this basic Meisner exercise called repetition. I'm sure you've seen it, where I would just say, "You're nodding your head," and you would say, "I'm nodding my head." And we would go back and forth in that. And it's really grounding in the present moment because my only job is to listen and observe, and I don't have to change anything about the moment. Meisner has a lot of parallels with improv work. A very big difference is that in improv, we're working at the height of your intelligence. And in Meisner says, thinking has no part in this process. So we're getting away from intellect, and just that repetition exercise helps us to ground in like simply what is happening with Christine and how can I just be with her in this moment. So we start there, and that's a huge part of when I'm singing. What the heck do I focus on to get my focus off of myself? And then from there, we build. I certainly think that there's room for if I have a difficult passage or a note that if I don't think about it technically, I will hurt myself. I think there are Meisner tools. One is a fantastic one called the physical impediment or an impersonation that really helps us to do something technically while still remaining in the moment. But the primary focus in Meisner is not planning and just going, I'll set myself up for success, perhaps with a technical tool, certainly with some emotional preparation. But then I'm off to sea. And as Meisner says, the text is like a canoe, and the river on which it sits is your emotion. So if I'm singing, if I were a belle, and I've seen it done, drunk and in love, right? That doesn't mean that how I feel today or in a moment, it has to be done drunken in love. I think that Lesser wrote it so beautifully that we get drunken in love no matter how you sing it. So listening to what you're getting in the moment is more important. And I'll stop there.
I love all of that. And first of all, just backing up to the listeners, maybe you all knew, I did not. How many times I have done that exercise and had no idea it was Meisner. So that's very cool.
Oh,
And maybe some of the listeners, maybe you're the same. Maybe you've done the first one, the
yeah.
repetition. So that was fascinating. And so my question following that or my follow-up question would be when, for all of, we're both in New York City and we're both working with Broadway artists who, uh, many of them originate the roles, but some of them do not. They go into the role after someone else has originated it. And depending on the show, it can kind of be like a machine. And you have to step how the person stepped, and you have to raise your hand how the person raised your hand. And you have to pretty much map out the same exact course as what they had froze from the original creator.
Mhm.
Um, how does someone go about that working with that kind of machine while still having their own fresh experience?
That's such a good question. And I think whether you're stepping into someone's track that we need to emulate pretty strictly, or you're working with a director who has a very specific way of the way they want things done and maybe gives you line reads, I think that there can be a beauty in a parameter of play, and we can look at it almost like choreography, where I can still dance impulsively, but I do need to follow the steps. So this happened in one of the first musicals I did after taking Meisner was Thoroughly Modern Millie. So there's definitely a rhythm and a style with that kind of comedy. And so I was talking to my Meisner teacher about doing that, and he really set me up for success with how I now teach it and look at it in my own work of like, yeah, I have to follow that rhythm. I have to say it this certain way because that is how the joke gets a laugh. But what I'm noticing about the moment and how it's impacting me can always be fresh. So I liken it to a singer who gets on stage and you feel like if you were to push them, they would be so stiff and they'd be like, no, 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 don't push me. Versus a singer who gets on stage and they're singing, and you feel like if you were to push them, they'd be like, what the heck? Why'd you do that? And like work off of it. Those are the differences. And we can still do the same steps and choreography within that, but be the kind of person who, if something is thrown at me, I'm gonna react to that.
Mhm. I think that's really important for our artists because
Hmm.
I think a lot of us go to New York. I'm grateful for some amazing mentors that I got to work with in Colorado before I moved to New York. And one of them pulled me aside and said, why do you want to go to New York? And I said, well, I want to perform and I want to create. And he said, do you want to create? And I said, yes. And he said, and you want to create on the Broadway stage? And I said, no, I just
Hmm.
want to create. And he said, then you should go to New York. And he said,
Mm,
but if you want to create on the Broadway stage, very few get to be the first creators, and the rest follow like a machine. He's the one who had referred to it as a machine.
yeah.
And I was like, oh, wow, how interesting. And now that I've been there for, 20 years, being able to see how wonderful artists are up there and hearing their experiences of having to navigate doing a role exactly like the person who
Hmm.
had originated it is very challenging. And so anything that they can do to make it their own, to make it fresh for themselves, even though they are. I love that you kind of referred to it like a dance. Like, yeah, well, you
Yeah.
still have to do the steps with everybody else. And, or we just saw the Rockettes a week ago. And even seeing all of them, I mean, they have to like really be
Yeah.
there together. And yet, I'm sure that there's a uniqueness to every single one of them of how they're doing such a phenomenal job up there as a team and yet creating, some kind of fresh, new experience each year.
Completely. And we also want to be inclusive of what we are going through emotionally that day. Meisner says that we can only assume that what I'm feeling, the character is also feeling. So let's say that you're playing Glinda on Broadway, and that's definitely a track that they're like, these beats have to happen. But you're going through, oh, how about not even a breakup? Like, let's say that you're dating someone and they're being really weird on text and maybe like not responding and it's gutting you inside. I believe, and Meisner believed, that there's a world in which we can sing popular, acknowledging beforehand what's going on for me as a human being, making it slightly imaginary so that I don't harm my psyche. But then I can go into popular and sing that as a person who is getting mixed messages in a text from someone I'm dating. And I know that that might sound like surface level, but I say that example because we do want to be really careful that if you've just lost a brother-in-law, you don't want to go on stage and use that as emotional preparation. But that texting example is a very small way that we can still do the choreography, so to speak, but honor what our emotional experience is that day and see if it can not even infuse itself into Glinda, but make her singing popular that night make more sense in a new way that we've never had it make sense before.
Yeah. And who's to say that that didn't just happen to Glinda and the
Right.
in that world, you know?
Completely agree. And again, that goes back to the trust of the composer. We have to trust that it was written in a way, and I think it often is, that already makes it silly and uplifting so that then whatever uh, dualities I have going on that day as a human being can exist in there and the music can still make sense.
Well, I think our dualities are part of what make us,
Mm-hmm.
our own individual selves.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. It helped me a lot when I started studying my training in New York. We study Western and Eastern. And
Cool.
studying Eastern modalities, and of course, that's yin and yang. And
Hmm.
so when things were referred to yin and yang and how we each have all of that within us made so much sense with everything. That's when for me it was like, oh, it's of course I have these other emotions within me that Dr. Starkey was talking about. And of
Hmm.
course I have these within me too. And it's like our nervous system, the ebb and flow, and can we keep it regulated so that it continues to have that ebb and flow instead of, you know,
Right.
building and building and building and building and building until we explode.
Absolutely. I think if we can look at art as a container as well, whether that's your practice session or a class that you're taking, a place where I finally get to let the lid off and then I'm safe. I'm going to put it back on to be a nice human being when I leave this room is really helpful so that people feel that they can explore in a place that hopefully feels safe enough to catch them with a soft landing at the end of that.
Mhm. I think that's why it would be very smart to study it for a little bit, go to
Yeah.
class, take it for a little bit, as opposed to just trying something new out of the gate. Like go ahead
Yeah.
with people who are exploring that vulnerability with you. Um, so I would love to hear about your programs. Like, how do you implement this into the work you're doing? Is it all acting classes? Do you bring that into the voice world? Are they master classes? Are they private sessions? I want to hear about your whole program.
Yes, I do offer private sessions and I've done master classes. I have a couple coming up. And but the primary way that we would want to study Meisner is in a class setting. So while a master class is great, as you just expressed, it can take time to build trust and not only with the group, but with yourself to do this work. So I love a master class. And I think a class over time is really the way to study Meisner. So we heard a huge call for flexibility and different pricing options. So we offer two ways to take class. Both have online and New York City components. So we have one way called MIM Gym, Meisner Music Gym, and that's with my associate teachers who are amazing, Jonathan Heller and Adam White. And those are flexible class packages. I just came up with this and TBD on if it sticks, but I think it's brilliant where you can buy a class package just like you would at a yoga studio, 2, 4, 6, or 8 classes. And then we have classes throughout the month that you can sign up for and reschedule at your leisure. That is fantastic, but it's more for someone who would need flexible structuring and is okay with not being with the same group of people. If you wanted the same group of people and a more intensive structure, every spring starting in March and every fall starting in September, I teach a 12-week intensive class, both online and in New York City, which is much more intensive with the people that you're with. And then obviously, we're following a lesson structure that builds upon itself and then culminates in a final off Broadway performance, which is optional for everyone, including the online students. I love being with students for 3 months. And sometimes people will take the 12-week class more than once. But I really see a lot of progress when someone is able to stick it out. It's interesting around the halfway mark, maybe the 8-week mark. It is so without fail, people are like getting frustrated and they're like, I'm just not getting it. I'm like, stick it out. And then by the end, they finish with this amazing performance and feel so good. So I love that. And then finally, we also train teachers. So we have a totally self-paced online teacher training course that's videos of me teaching students of different levels, and then also walking you through this Meisner and Music course, which covers almost all of the curriculum that we teach with an accompanying workbook and practice log. And then we just announced Adam White and I are going to teach a teacher certification, which will be like a more intensive teacher training with asynchronous elements, and then 2 live days this June 28th and 29th. So that will be more focused on private teachers, which we've heard a call for. The teacher training course is kind of like more based towards teachers who would teach it in a classroom setting. And then the teacher certification would be more for people that are doing this one-on-one. So, oh, I just love it. And I think it can change lives. It certainly has changed mine.
Right. And to the listeners, Jillian is going to join the Visceral Voice Academy to come and chat with us for an hour on the 22nd at 11. And that is Eastern on Zoom. So you can be anywhere and you could tune in, and we'll have a drop-in rate available for that. So please join us. You can just head on to the website and just click on the drop-in link if you want to hear some more, which I cannot wait to hear more. And I think everyone should take Jillian's classes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it has been such a pleasure. I had mentioned before we started that I often send rough draft questions to guests that are going to come onto the podcast. And I didn't do that for this one, pretty much because I knew what Meisner was of being in the moment and communicating and listening. And so I wanted this episode to very much be that, where we just have the ebb and flow of us just conversing and looking at each other and communicating as is meant to happen in our lives. And so I'm grateful I didn't. A lot of times when we pre-program some questions, we're thinking about something else other than what is being said. So I wanted to make sure that just due to the topic of our conversation, that it was able to be fluid.
I love that. I really had so much fun talking to you, Christine. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. Please check out Jillian real quick before we go. How can they get in touch with you? Where do they go to sign up for classes? How do they do that?
Yes, meisnerinmusic.com. That's Meisner in music is the best way to get in touch with us. There's also, if you want to hop on a phone call with me, there's a way to get a consult call with me if you're not sure if this is the best thing for you or if where you are in your journey, it would be right to take Meisner in music. So feel free to get in touch with us there. You can also email me. It is me at that helm of meisnerinmusic@gmail.com. And then if you want to stay updated with valuable posts and education, we're always updating the Instagram at Meisner in Music.
Yay. Great, Jillian. Thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation. It was so wonderful to spend this hour with you.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, tell your colleagues, students, and friends. Subscribe, rate, and please write a review. You can find us on Instagram or Facebook, and feel free to check out my website at www.thevisceralvoice.com for information on programs and upcoming events. I hope you join us next time for another wonderful conversation on The Visceral Voice.